All right, we're heading into our final stretch. Are you guys still awake? Yes. All right. What we will do is now go right into our last session, and we will start that last session with you. Right? So we're not going to sit and listen to us again, but rather you'll start that. And what I'll do first is two things. One is we'll have some announcements, a couple of announcements, but then we'll try and frame the parameters of the discussion, if you will, under the heading, the broad heading of where do we go from here, right? So in terms of announcements, how many people are here from Massachusetts? Okay. All right. Well, talk to Wendy from Somerville for Palestine. She has got a petition she'd like you to consider signing if you haven't done so already. Secondly, and that's very much part of where do we go from here, a subset of that is what can we do about all of this, is the effort that the Maine Coalition for Human Rights in Maine and the Maine Coalition for Palestine, which is part of the Maine Coalition for Human Rights, has been pushing and working very hard on with the state legislature, which is the adoption of 1383, LD 1383, with the request to divest Maine's pension funds from all. So, do you want to use that microphone to explain? Willow can explain to everybody what the effort is and what's going to happen. There's an update that he would like everybody to know about, yeah? Yes. About today, this week.
Is this working? Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Fateh. So yeah, as you all may have heard, we learned the week before last from a reliable inside source that the State and Local Government Committee planned to bypass the democratic process by unanimously killing divestment from ICE and genocide. Yeah, pretty awful. This is despite more than 150 people, including many of you here today, showing up to testify in favor of this bill earlier this year. That's the most people who have ever attended a state and local government committee hearing in Maine's history, apparently. Now, after more than 450 people in just 3 days wrote to Maine legislature leadership and the committee, urging them to respect democracy and hold a fair vote on LD 1383, the kill vote planned for last Wednesday was postponed. Yeah, it's great. So now divestment will either pass or be killed this Wednesday, March 4th at 11 a.m. in the State House. This is on the calendar, so they can't postpone this anymore. This is when it will come to a head. The State and Local Government Committee wants to kill divestment quietly. They want to keep investing in Palantir and other horrible companies, and they want to see the movement that you all have built dissolve in silence. But that won't happen. They're cowards, and we are not. So this Wednesday, we will fill the committee room and witness their vote. I'd like to see them try and kill divestment from ICE and genocide, something they know is morally correct, while you are there to witness it. I think that they'll blink first. So, please join me in Augusta this coming Wednesday, March 4th at 11 a.m. to witness the committee vote on LD 1383. If you're not up to date on our email list, you can go to the tabling area on the other side of the third floor, and we'll send out some updates probably on Monday. But yeah, we want to fill the room so that they know that they're not doing this in silence. Thank you.
Thank you, Willow. Thank you. And now if I may invite you to the stage, Rami and Phyllis, Lindsay, and Nadia. Just kind of, and we will, while they're coming up and getting ready, let's talk about what we hope to do in this coming session, right? And the idea is under a pretty broad heading of where do we go from here, You can think of it as, in a way, in a couple of ways. One, in terms of analysis, kind of an analysis of what do you think will happen in the next 6 months, year, 5 years, if we keep going the way we're going, if we don't keep going the way we're going. Just some projection, some crystal ball kind of stuff, given what we've been hearing about all day and what we've been talking about. So that's one aspect of where do we go from here. Another aspect of where do we go from here is what do we do about it? What can we do from here, given the various, things we've been talking about? And we've been talking about pretty complex and big, powerful stuff in terms of forces that are going to be defining what's going to happen, not just in Palestine, but also in the US and also in the world. So in thinking about that, the questions comes up with just following right up from Susan's presentation. I'm sorry we didn't have, we will kind of conflate the discussion of what you were saying into that, and I will start with that. The question is, given the power dynamics and the economic power dynamics and in the world, what could be the continuing viability of relying on international law if it continues to be without teeth, and if it continues to be only the political decision-making that will decide whether or not law applies or doesn't apply, is used or not used, enforced or not enforced. So that is a big question on the law, and it's open to everybody to either to make their assessments or ask it further. So the question is viability of international law. Another one is what is our role as civil society, who don't have political power as such, political decision-making power as such, who don't have the kind of money that those big moneyed giants have that to basically influence the political process. So we know we're talking about, a very good example is what Willow was talking about in terms of, pushing legislation, working on that. There's another question about the entry of progressive politics into the political arena, the viability of continuing to push the Democratic Party, continuing to field candidates like Zohran Mamdani and others to try and influence that process. So there's a whole range of things we can talk about there. The sub-question of that, and that's an issue I've started to have a discussion with our colleagues and siblings in Jewish Voice for Peace here in Maine, which is the question that keeps arising, and it arose, that's what brought us here as well. Mm-hmm. Who speaks for the Jewish community? How can, we know that the gap between the leadership and the rank and file that we talked about in the Democratic Party, that we talked about in the general political, also exists in the Jewish community, right? So the legacy institutions, the main institutions of Jewish life in the US is still very much wedded to Israel. The growing strength of progressive Jewish voices, especially young Jews in the US, is having an amazing effect. But how much of an effect is it? Can we, how can we talk with, kind of push that agenda of demanding who has the right to speak for the Jewish community, if anybody? Unless we all have the right to speak for the Jewish community. I speak as a Palestinian, but I don't speak on behalf of all Palestinians. I don't say ever, Palestinians think 1, 2, 3. I can't, because I don't represent all Palestinians, and I recognize that. So anyway, it's a question, which raises the last question I was going to raise as possible area for discussion, which is, when you're talking about solutions to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, We often think in terms of occupied territories. There are proposals for two-state solutions, of course. There are proposals for incremental achievement of some kind of autonomy until such time that maybe the environment is okay for us to think about a Palestinian state, which is what Oslo was. We can talk about, and there have been movements, groupings, that insist on a two-state solution, but a confederacy. We will learn to live together, and that's part of the thinking about this movement called A Land for All, which insists on essentially recognizing the Jewishness of the Jewish state by law, and then having a Palestinian non-Jewish state next to it, and somehow they can live together. But not a word about, almost 2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel who are not Jewish. So where do they go? Do they get cut off and joined to the Palestinian side? I mean, very strange, Anyway, that's... Or we can talk about a secular democratic state. Right? I mean, the idea that, human rights, equality, non-discrimination, the absolute equality of all human beings demands a secular democratic state, where no state is governed by an ethnicity or any kind of a supremacist attitude, whether it is a Muslim state or a Christian state or a Jewish state or a Balkan state or whatever. You can have an attachment to a piece of land, but you don't translate that into an exclusive ownership of that piece of land to the exclusion of all others. So maybe we can talk about that. But that's all. These are big, future of Palestine kind of issues. So I'm going to stop. I talked too much. But the idea here is we're going to open the floor first and hear what thoughts people have, and what questions they have, what suggestions they have on any of the topics that I mentioned as possibly fitting under where do we go from here. So it's up to you. The microphone is there, and help yourself. And we'll do, a number, probably, I don't know how many, we'll see, until we get tired of hearing you, maybe, but, and then we'll have a chance to respond. Go ahead.
Yeah, two forces for change that I haven't heard of much in this discussion, one to do with domestic politics and one to do with geopolitics, is the rise of the right-wing opposition to Israel First, the America First movement, that has convergence with the liberal internationalist humanitarian movement to cut off aid to Israel. And I'm curious how that dynamic is going to play out both in our domestic politics and the impact on the movement to cut aid to Israel. And the second is the shifting power balance, which is really a longer-term trend. The United States is no longer the biggest economy in the world. Over time, we will not be the biggest military in the world over time. This is not an immediate issue, but I did not hear anything about the rise of BRICS and the changing geopolitics as it's going to affect Palestine over time. Obviously, the fate of Palestine is interwoven with both of those phenomenon.
Thank you. Please. No, I think a series of them. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were just do both. I think a lot of us since October have been waiting anxiously to see Israel's economy crater. We've felt that it was an unsustainable project, at least at an economic level. And it seems that Israel's economy really has cratered, except for defense, except for military and surveillance systems, which the world seems absolutely starving for. And I'm just sort of curious if you can talk a little bit about how we can convince, as individuals, our countries to not buy into the hyper-militarization that's both encumbering our rights as individuals all around the world, feeding into authoritarianism, feeding into fascism and suppression, but also the only thing that's really keeping Israel's economy afloat. And I think a lot of that has to do with ties to, looking at what historical movements have succeeded. And I think a lot of us would say apartheid South Africa really worked because of divestment. And, how do we as individuals make divestment movements work when nation states are still feeding the industrial complex that's essentially keeping all of these fascist tactics afloat?
Thank you.
This is a question for Susan Akram. Is there a mechanism at the UN for changing the structure of the Security Council? The world has changed a lot, and it's not democratic. I mean, I think we should empower them in a way that was intended, or is more in line with what was intended from its original inception. Is there a mechanism for doing that? Thank you.
Let's take one or two more, and then maybe if people are kind of chomping at the bit.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
My name is Kate. I live in Wyndham, the next town over. A couple of observations. I think the way forward, well, the Italian dock workers who went on strike a few months ago helped, I think, show us the way forward. The strike movement and the spread throughout the ports of Europe. And I have a feeling the so-called ceasefire, which is phony, but it had to be called partly in reaction to the European working class threatening a major uprising. I have a feeling that may be part of it. Also, the way forward is what happened in Minneapolis, the so-called general strike against ICE. It wasn't actually a general strike, but it was an amazing fight back. I think one of the things that will do anything is a literal general strike. Workers deny their Labor Party. That will move things forward. Also, one more about the other gentleman's observation on the splits in the right. Who would have, I have profound disagreements with Tucker Carlson. In some ways I can't stand the guy, but who would have thought that Tucker Carlson would emerge as America's foremost spokesman for Palestinian rights? Who would have thought that? It's pretty amazing. So, and also I'd be wary of progressive Democrats. I worked for one of Bernie Sanders' campaigns years ago. I'm from Vermont. I actually had a beer with him years ago, though he probably doesn't remember me from Adam. But he's covering for genocide. He's trying to blame only Netanyahu. He doesn't want to call it a genocide.
Who are you talking about?
Bernie Sanders,
Bernie Sanders.
senator from Vermont. And I used to personally know him. Well, he doesn't remember me, but I think he's literally covering for genocide. I think we should be very wary of the duopoly. So.
Thank you. Do one more, and then go ahead.
Thank you all. These are, some people stole my earlier comments. These are mostly in response to Professor Akram's notes. One is sort of the idea of consensus-based decisions as being more effective and longer lasting, and thinking about the situation in Israel and Palestine and also around the world, right, as such a sort of constant back and forth of powers, of whoever has power at one given moment sort of retaliating, and thinking about a consensus-based solution as sort of the only way forward, as difficult as that might be for people who think of themselves as having so much to be against each other on. And then also kind of bouncing on the UN idea, like thinking a little bit about like the Audre Lorde, like the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house, and the idea that like written in the UN Charter is this sort of power imbalance of the Security Council, and is it, if it's not viable to change that because it's written into the Charter, is there perhaps an avenue for having a different organization that's not the United Nations, perhaps a new one, or I don't quite know what there is. And then just as a quick last point, also on piggybacking on the idea of this sort of bottom-up power of like strikes and these sorts of things as perhaps being also in a way like demonstrating the power of the people as opposed to these sort of top-down structures. And I do think that bottom-up resistance actually demonstrates a lot of these sort of facade that the top-down structures have, and the ability of the people to affect change on their own terms. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we just continue and then just take it all in, or do you feel?
To comment, because there's too many
Okay,
questions.
yeah, go ahead.
You want to start? Rob?
No, at least you start. I'll pass it down.
Oh, here. Do you want it? You want to start, Susan? Because you didn't. Oh, sure, I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, there's one here.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
So let's see. Is this working? Can you hear me? No. I use this one. So in terms of the possibility of structural change between the Security Council and the General Assembly, of course, the General Assembly can amend the UN Charter. And there had been some discussion with the BRICS in some of the early meetings that one of the main points on their agenda was expanding the Security Council. There were a couple of different proposals on the table, as I remember, either expanding the total number, but also having more permanent seats on the Security Council representing the countries that were that had the majority people populations in the world. I don't know what has happened with that proposal, and that proposal also surfaced with the Hague Group. And after a lot of fanfare, the Hague Group seems to have gone silent. So I don't know where those proposals are. But this is also in the hands of the General Assembly. So any amendment to the Charter, and there's another very important provision in the Charter, which is the ability to suspend any United Nations member state from the organization. Israel could be suspended from the United Nations. And again, that would be vote of the General Assembly to do that. So there are some tools that do exist. And again, the BRICS countries, their populations need to be pressuring them to demand change and better representation at the United Nations. I am not one who believes that there is an alternative to the United Nations. I think the answer lies within the UN itself and efforts to reform this imbalance in the powers. But again, law is really, really important. International law is all we have. And the ability to enforce it does not only lie in the international bodies, but in our national courts. The decisions coming out of the International Court of Justice can be taken to national courts as the basis of litigation. For example, the provisional measures from the ICJ can be taken and are being used in the cases that I mentioned about complicity, because right away the International Court of Justice proclaimed that what Israel was doing was genocidal acts. And so that is enormously powerful for any kind of litigation that takes place in national courts. And that raises the issue of universal jurisdiction. We can talk more about that. But those kinds of cases are happening. And they're happening more and faster. And there's a larger group of international lawyers than I have ever seen in my 40 years of practice, working on issues to hold Israeli perpetrators and complicit corporations accountable.
A quick addendum to that, if I may quickly, Rami, is that when you do use those mechanisms, there will also be pushback. So it does take courage and it takes strength to do it. So all of the Palestinian human rights organizations, for example, including the one I used to direct many years ago, Al-Haq, plus Al-Mizan, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, have all been declared terrorist organizations for daring to bring cases before the European courts.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Susan was saying, and not only because I have to ride on the train with her tonight to go back to Boston, but also because everything she's saying I think is correct. But we have to find a scale. I mean, we and people around the world who are interested in this, that there needs to be a scale of activity that ultimately has impact. Right now, the impact is occasionally limited to a case in this country or something in that country, because the power structure globally is still one in which the big powers, the Western imperial powers, will do what they're doing in Iran. I mean, Gaza was a signal to the world. You resist us, you die. You don't just die. You make life impossible in your country for people or animals or plants. So it's a big risk to do this. But I think one of the approaches that strikes me as possibly productive would be if we had more and more national cases using national law that links to international law. And for instance, if we had one country arrest an Israeli official and take them to court using the existing mechanisms. Just if one country did that, or even if it wasn't arrested, if Israelis, officials or soldiers who travel abroad and Hind Rajab Foundation now has compiling names of so many hundreds of people, I think, who are liable for this. If this happens, we don't know which one of these cases will suddenly light a fire. If people see that, well, they're not invincible. It's like the Americans in Vietnam. When the Vietnam pushed back against them, after a while people said, oh, the Americans are not invincible. You can throw them out. And the same thing happened in Afghanistan. And the whole anti-colonial movement was based on sort of momentum from people resisting. Of course, that's risky. The chances of your dying are very high. But this is the nature of this process. Liberation comes at a price. But I think using the law to do this is less risky than militarily trying to confront the United States. So this is the approach that strikes me as possibly feasible.
What they said. But I have very quick responses to 4 of the 7 questions. Okay, so number 1 on the international law thing, the issue is enforcement. The problem isn't, I mean, there's problems with the law as written, but that's not the main problem. The main problem is that there's no enforcement at the institutional level. So I just want to remind us about this notion of us as enforcers, right? That's our job, because there's campaigns in various places about using the Uniting for Peace precedent. Call on the UN to use Uniting for Peace. Well, they have been. This fantastic General Assembly resolution of last September was taken under Uniting for Peace. That doesn't mean it's going to be enforced. It means it gives civil society a list of things that it's being called for individual nation states to do. That's what it does. So that means it's then our job to be mobilizing. And ours in the US, let's be clear, is the hardest of any other country. I would just say on that question about like the BRICS and others, I think it's problematic, among other things, with the expansion of the BRICS to include a bunch of U.S. allies. I'm not quite sure why they did that, but it does undermine the potential of the BRICS. The Hind Rajab Foundation, which, how many of you have heard of it? Oh, a lot. Okay, but not everybody. The Hind Rajab Foundation is doing the work of what Rami just talked about, of going after individual Israeli soldiers who traditionally, after their 2 years in the military, traveled around the world for tourism and whatever before going back to settle down to work or school or whatever. In Brazil, they had their first success where they identified, I think it was 4 Israeli soldiers who had bragged on social media about what they had done in Gaza. And they notified the Brazilian courts and said these people should be investigated as potential war criminals. The Israeli government got so nervous about that prospect, they sent a jet, rounded them up wherever they were on the beach or whatever, and brought them home before they could be picked up. So this is the kind of thing, this very creative, and Hind Rajab, of course, was the 6-year-old child who, yeah, you all know the story. So I think that is a very important possibility. Second, on the question of the UN, years ago, during the Clinton years, when everybody was talking about multilateralism and the UN, and Madeleine Albright was talking about, among other things, 500,000 dead Iraqi children, but putting that aside for the moment, there was a lot of talk about the UN and the role of the US as part of a multilateral world, blah, blah, blah. I wrote this book about US domination of the UN. And a lot of people read it and said, wow, you're really saying we need a new UN, right? And I said, no, because any international institution that is built today will not reflect the power relations of the post-World War II moment. It will reflect the power relations of today, in which the US remains the single most influential power because of the combination of military, economic, political, diplomatic, every means, cultural. That's the biggest one of all in some ways, that it controls around the world. So from my thinking, it is about how to change the UN, not getting rid of it. Third, on the question of Jewish voices. I mean, I said sarcastically that, yes, I speak for all Jews, clearly. But what is happening is the extraordinary shift of public opinion within the Jewish community. It is very generational, which is fabulous on the one hand and devastating on another hand. Because the power of the existing institutional organizations of the Jewish community are still dominated by people of my generation, frankly, but who do not reflect the views of so many young Jews, controlling the institutional power, the money, the lobbying, all those things. And that implies a continuation until this younger generation takes over those institutions. When they do, it's going to be amazing. But again, we don't have time to wait. So that's our challenge. We need to do more work, and the work of Jewish Voice for Peace, which I feel honored to work with, has been extraordinary and continues to be. At the last convention in Baltimore, 2,700 people came together for 4 days to talk strategy. That's why you're seeing these amazing protests all around the country of self-identified Jews of all different stripes, all different kinds of Judaism, coming together to use the privilege that comes from Jewish organizations and Jewish organizing in this country to say, we are going to stand for Palestine. And we are going to use that privilege to make as strong a point as we can. Finally, on the question of solutions. Certainly there's debates. One state, two state, red state, blue state, this state, that state. There's another way of thinking about it, which it will not surprise you to know that I have my own opinions about how many states there should be and whatever. But at the end of the day, I'm a Jewish girl from California. I don't have a right to say how many states there should be on this little patch of land 7,000 miles away. My family doesn't come from there. My parents never went there. My grandparents never went there. So why should I be having anything to say about it? I don't. What I have something to say about is, what does my government do that's influencing the situation there that would allow people there, Jews, Palestinians, Israeli non-Jews, everybody, to decide how many states they want. What I'm concerned about is rights, international law, human rights, and equality for all. If there's one state, equality for all within the one state. If there's two states, equality for all within each state and between both states. That's the one nobody ever talks about. Nobody wants equal states. But the bottom line is, we don't have to talk about states. It's not our business, frankly, except for those in this room who are either Israeli or Palestinian. Those of us who are not, it's really not our business. We should be fighting with our government to support these other things. Thank you.
Well, unlike the people next to me, I have almost nothing to say about the UN, but they all did such a good job that luckily I don't feel like I have to. Since no one else talked about it, a little bit on the right-wing opposition to Israel and Tucker Carlson and all of that. If they can help end this situation, great. I'll take it any way I can get it. But I don't think there's any way for progressives working on this to align or make use of that opposition because of what it's about, because of some of the things we talked about, because it is of a piece with the targeting of immigrants in this country, because it is of a piece with targeting of diversity and equity and inclusion programs in this country. If we line up with Tucker Carlson, we are lining up against the immigrants who he also wants to target. And so there's nothing there. There's no there. We can't take advantage of that. Like I said, if they can help, if what they're doing helps bring it down, I'll take it. But that's as far as that goes. And then as the general strike question, I think the good news, because a real general strike would be so incredibly hard to pull off, is that I don't think we need a full general strike to be effective. I think Minnesota was a great example of what kinds of things can be really effective. But I think we need to remember sort of like strike is a tactic, but who is it for? What are our demands of a strike, of a general strike, and who are we demanding it of? And that's where it, unfortunately, it comes back to Congress. I think this is a little bit like the UN. Yeah, it's got a lot of problems, but it's what we've got. And so that's what we have to work with. And so I think, what this needs to come back to is stop the funding for Israel, stop the funding for weapons, stop the funding for ICE. All of that is the way that this would stop. The courts are another good option. But especially in the case of the UN courts, where we have a little bit of work to do before on the enforcement piece, the quickest path to stopping it is the money.
Just one more really quick thing on this point about what a step towards general strikes can look like. Minneapolis has given us so many incredible, creative new tactics. And one of them, which I don't know if you have all heard about, when I heard about it, I was cheering because I had just never thought of it. There's a bunch of white, native-born U.S. citizens driving around Minneapolis with their passports in their pocket and giant Mexican flags attached to their car or truck. They are distracting the ICE people who go after them like bees and honey, or whatever that analogy is. So it takes them 2, 3, 4 hours to figure out that these are really not anybody that they can take into custody. And during those 4 hours, they're not out arresting immigrants. It was a great move.
It is a great move, and it's made me think whether I could put a Puerto Rican flag on my, because they don't know that Puerto Rico is part of the United States, so you can do that too. Nice.
Okay, go ahead, Sam.
All right, yeah, whatever. So this is somewhat related to the Republicans and all of the other somewhat opposition, but how do we, as in all the people in this room, all the people that support Palestine, move on from, for lack of a better term, preaching to the choir? How do we move on to actually speaking to people who don't agree with us, people who are against us, people like these older generations, these conservatives, Wall Street, liberals who don't have time for politics, all of those people who are against or simply don't have a position? How do we reach out to them and actually get them to change their minds so we can come together more?
Thank you. Sally.
So my comment and question for you is around changing the narrative. You started to talk about ways in which we can do that, but I think one of the pieces of narrative that we're needing to talk about, and we don't, is Hamas. We need to bring Hamas into the conversation. When my husband and I first went to the West Bank, we were in Balata refugee camp. And the person who was talking with us said, the first thing, and it's always stayed in my mind, you must not romanticize us, the Palestinian people. We are human just like everybody else. And I have to admit, I had been romanticizing the Palestinian people. They were victims. To me, the victims, you tend to put a whole bunch of stuff onto that. That is a projection of what you believe they need. So anyway, we also must not demonize people. People aren't all bad. And I think what clearly happens in this culture is that you hear the, yeah, but what about Hamas? Yeah, but what about Hamas? And so I don't think we do a good job about bringing Hamas into the conversation. And Hamas has changed over the years. Its charter has changed. I'm not saying that it's without problems. I'm just saying I think we need to talk about it.
You can read Rami's book.
Yeah, excellent.
Go ahead, Rich.
So my name is Ridgely Fuller, and I'm from Belfast, the second city in Maine that divested from Israel. And my comment is to all Mainers, which is the easiest, quickest step that we can take, is to elect a new Senator Graham Plattner.
Ridgely, can you speak into the mic so we can hear you?
Oh, okay.
Even though you're talking to them.
The easiest, quickest thing that we as Mainers can do is make sure that we elect Graham Plattner. The first time I ever heard him speak, one of the first things he was talking about was the horror of Gaza. He's a vet. He's talking about stopping the money. Please, the primary's June 9th. We've got to get Janet Mills out as the Democratic nominee, and then it's Susan Collins. And we can do it. So Graham Plattner.
Thank you. Aisha?
Thank you. My comment is related to also like what can we do, and hearing this conversation, especially in Maine, is a little bit of not just thought-provoking, but also rises in me a little bit of guilt as well, because I live on stolen land, occupied land, and it's hard to figure out like what is our role and what is our role here, and then how do we emulate that in places like Palestine, in Kashmir, in all other parts of the world. And the guilt is because I understand the fight of Palestinians, and I see the fight of indigenous communities, and yet very much complicit in the status quo. And I think that also brings a challenge of this idea or notion of a secular democracy, if that's the best fit. And I live in a quote-unquote secular democracy, and it is not fair, it's not just, and it is more than anything else, exceptionalism of a certain type and supremacy of a certain type of people. So I think, Phyllis, you kind of addressed a little bit of this, like what type of governance or structures would it take, and it's hard to have any faith in a type of a governance. So the question that comes to my mind is, what kinds of pressures do we need to put on our own government, and not just when it's a hot topic like ongoing genocide, but the genocide that we have been supporting and benefiting from here in the United States, not just ICE raids when they're here in our cities, but I grew up in Texas, and there have been ICE raids and dreamers who I've grown up with all my life who've been scared. So there's a lot of these issues that are legacies that we benefit from. So how do we not just stay in a hot moment and get rised up, but actually think about it systematically, not just based on who's in office and how do we stand up against them, but what is our country and democracy should look like in general.
Thank you.
I'll be much more specific, but first I want to thank all of the speakers who did a fantastic job at getting us to really think deeply. So I'm going to really hook my question onto what Lindsay was saying. Right now, they're beginning to discuss the next MOU that Israel and the U.S. Will sign. And I noticed that Netanyahu has more or less said we are going to do our best not to have U.S. aid in the future. Now, I focused on that because we have had great success really getting new people on board by pointing to the way our money is being used and using the resource provided. You know, if you look at your town, you could see where the money, how much money is going to Israel. If they do succeed in basically divesting themselves from military aid by basically having these joint projects in which the U.S. can end up funding even more, giving even more support to Israel. That might be a way, they hope, of defusing our use of this excellent topic for our outreach. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, because in my view, that is the way to reach new people. I haven't seen anything else work as well as that. Thank you.
I don't know if you want to respond. Hi, my name's Alan Clements, and I got here after lunch, so I missed a bunch of really good content, I think. And again, I want to thank the presenters also. But Professor Akram, you ended your presentation with something about the people, sort of a charge to the responsibility of the people, and I think that's really important. And since the beginning, since October 7th, I've been involved in the issue for decades, but since October 7th and seeing the obvious scale of the carnage unleashed by Israel with reflagged United States bombs and planes and helicopters, all but tanks. Israel, I understand, has their own domestically developed tank that after the 1967 war they made it a priority. It's apparently a tank that's also good at killing people and pedestrians in dense cities and things like that or something. But everything else is reflagged U.S. It's our money, it's our hardware, it's our ordnance. Even the arms that come from European countries is largely, if not mostly, made in the United States as well. And it's arms we've provided to European allies and so on, and it's just this circuitous route into Israel. So I think we've been is a movement or whatever we want to call it, a response to the genocide that I think we're way too easy on our U.S. government. And Professor Akron, you mentioned something about ratifying treaties and that everyone, all the nations, states of the world have ratified some of these treaties and the human rights and so on. And in the United States, it's actually part of our Constitution that codifies treaty obligations. It's in our Constitution, and I'm sure it is in many other countries, but probably not all. But in ours, it is. So since late October of 2023, I've been following the Center for Constitutional Rights and their response on this issue, and I believe that they were, I'm not sure if they were a plaintiff or represented, I think they were actually a plaintiff in a case in California in federal court, where the court actually agreed with them, but politely said it's not in our jurisdiction or something to that effect. It's not in our jurisdiction to tell the federal government how they're supposed to administer themselves or something, something like that. However, it's clear that the Constitution is on our side. And what I'm saying here in a way is that regardless of public opinion, or as much as we do want to change that, we can't rely on our elected officials to do anything. They know they're breaking the law, they know they're war criminals, but they also know that there's not a prosecutor in the land that's going to bring them before a court. So it's like, what I am saying here is that it seems to me that we sort of need to take the Constitution into our own hands and start having tribunals and just public events where with fully informed, very sophisticated detail that we present the case and record it and publicize it, make it available, of the crimes of our elected leaders, and specifically those that are funding and with their legal vote making laws with their legal decisions that they are committing a war crime after the fact of the genocide as it exists. So they've been doing this for decades, but after the big, the $19 billion spending bill that was approved, I think, in March or so of 2024, up until that, leading up to that, I tried to raise this issue because, again, you're voting for $19 billion with
wind it up because people are waiting.
With no restrictions other than you must buy our weapons and so on, where you can spend the money. But after the fact, well-documented fact of war crimes and crimes against humanity. So I just want to, if you can get a response, what I'm saying here is like taking the Constitution into our own hands and very publicly, without necessarily striving for a result, but bearing witness in a very public level of what our U.S. government is doing.
Thanks.
And I just wonder if you can talk about that.
Thank you. Please. No, I think the lady standing. Oh, you were saying. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry.
My apologies.
Thank you for the illustrious panel, all of you. Okay. Thank you for being so illustrious and willing to be here for us and for Palestine. So I just have a few points. I live in Lubeck. I'm Lynn. Where we live, Democrats are not so on board with any of this. We go to the protests, like you said, with our signs to try to educate them, basically. And I'm wondering if one of the ways that other people have said to win them over or to take their manpower and use it is to link ICE with the fact of being trained by the IDF or the IOF, point that out to them, and kindly confront them that there are two war parties, the red and the blue, because at most demonstrations in the north half of the state, they're not saying anything about anti-war. They've got every list against Trump, but they don't include that. And maybe we should all be ready to somehow sport shirts that say, not proud terrorist, but admitted, if you want to call me a terrorist in quotes, because that's what they're doing, just about. And I think that every day we all need to be talking about this, no matter to whom. If you get a stranger on the phone calling you and they ask you how you are, like the phone company or something, say, I'd be a lot better if we weren't funding a genocide. And I said that one day, and a man in Texas thanked me for expressing that and said he was Palestinian, and we proceeded to talk for 20 minutes. He was born and raised in Texas, but his dad and family are all in Palestine. And it is risky, but I think, like with Palestine Action, where oldsters in wheelchairs are ready, they say, what else am I doing? I may as well go sit in the street. Some of them are blind, and they're being hauled away. And the more people who are supporting the few, or whatever the number is, the less risk there is for those. And it is risky. Yep. And we need to do BDS seriously. Be sure not to use Amazon and the other things. It can be hard, but do it. And be ready to point out, especially to the Dems and the New York Times readers who are so proud of everything they think they know, that the media has been disingenuous for decades. It's nothing new. We just watched Soundtrack of a Coup and we're in tears. My daughter said, what's changed, since they took out Lumumba? And
Lynn, could you wind it up?
That's it. Okay.
Yeah.
The thing is, if they do suspend Israel or whatever we do, will there be a media to cover it? That's one question. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just taking this off so people can see what's on the back of this shirt. So my name is Cray, and one of the roots I want to point out to the genocide in Palestine is a European colonial entity called the United States, which enforces the interlocking systems of genocide, colonization, and enslavement globally. And that we must always be aware that whenever one of these three systems is at play, all three of these systems are at play. So one of my solutions is a global re-indigenization movement that starts here with the dismantling of the enslavement incarceration system. For those who are not aware, we have 4% of the global population, but 25% of the world's incarcerated people, followed next by Turkey, for obvious reasons, but we are still 122 times the amount of incarcerated people that Turkey has. So dismantling the incarceration system, which is based on enslavement and the transatlantic enslavement, in order to shift the power, dominance, and control of Israel, we must re-indigenize Turtle Island and remove the power status of the U.S. European colonial occupation of Turtle Island.
Thank you. Yep.
One of the earlier commenters mentioned bottom-up resistance. I can't resist making the observation that the sailors on the USS Gerald Ford seem to be giving that term a whole new meaning. For those who aren't aware, the Swabbies are apparently flushing their T-shirts down the toilets on the aircraft carrier to clog the pipes and make the thing return to base. Well, God bless them. It's a kind of, you might call it a sort of privy mutiny. Pun fully intended. This actually goes back a long ways. Those with long memories will remember that similar kinds of bottom-up resistance from the troops in Vietnam played a very important role in putting that conflict to an end. So it's not organized, I'm sure. It's very spontaneous. But those things can happen. So I guess thought experiment. Let's ask ourselves, what's the equivalent for us of flushing a T-shirt down an aircraft carrier's toilet? Because there's probably something. I know there have been cases where longshoremen, for example, have refused to load ships bound for Israel. That sort of thing, because we can't, as speaker after speaker has said, we cannot rely on our institutions. Second point, and I'd like to push back a little on the subject of Tucker Carlson. There's an old saying that politics makes strange bedfellows. And when it comes to Israel, if Tucker has gone sour on Israel, I'll get in bed with him on that one. I mean, metaphorically, He's not my type, but I think there's a certain tribalism that infects U.S. politics. There's us and then there's them. I think we need to take a more granular approach. Is this guy with me on this particular topic? If so, let's go. If he's against me on some other topic, then let's fight it out. But let's not keep our skirts clean. Let's get our skirts good and dirty. Because this is important stuff, and we need all the allies we can get. So I'm saying, dirty your skirts. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. When you sit down with, it's true. Can we not engage that, please?
Yeah, okay.
Just continue, because folks have been waiting to express their thoughts as well. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. An element that I see absent from the general discussion of impacts on the future of Palestine is the health of the land. Israel has raised the earth in Palestine, at times specifically targeting farmland and greenhouses. Presently, it seems that almost all space for agriculture has been contaminated. It's clear that Palestinians are now dependent on the aid of other countries for access to food. How can fertile land be regenerated from this devastation, and what is our responsibility to the earth?
Hello, I'm Muna from Massachusetts, and I'm involved in the Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace. First, I want to thank all the speakers. You've been fantastic, and I want to thank the main coalition for Palestine, for organizing this. What a wonderful event. I just want to talk about, because Phyllis talked about the organizing going on in the Jewish community, especially led by Jewish Voice for Peace, and we know that there's some great organizing going on in the Muslim community as well, and I want to talk about what's going on in the Christian community, because churches were such an important force in the struggle against the South African apartheid, and they're not there yet on Palestine, but they're making slow progress, I would say that. Especially some of the mainline churches, like the Presbyterian Church has been out there in passing resolutions and divesting. The Methodists aren't far behind, and the Anglicans are far behind, and I, as a Roman Catholic, I'm kind of embarrassed that our church is really not where it should be, and not at all. I have friends here from Pax Christi, which is the national and international Catholic peace organization, and we have been trying to get the Archbishop of Boston to, to call. Now, we used to ask him to call for a ceasefire. Now there's supposed to be a ceasefire, but to make any some statement, but he has refused. So, just to mention, so I think there's a lot more that can be done in the churches. You could look to the videos by Reverend Munther Isaac. They're on YouTube. If you want to approach Christians, it's another angle to discuss, to start talking about Palestine and what the indigenous Palestinian Christians are talking about. Bethlehem Bible College has a lot of resources. Someone alluded to it before. Also, if you want to address Christian Zionism, Reverend Stephen Sizer has an excellent website. And as well, there is a new Kairos document put out by the Palestinian Christian community in Palestine, and that is, crying out for action from the rest of the Christian churches. There is also an apartheid-free church network that your churches can join. So, thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
Kathleen Sutherland of Portland and other places, Egypt and other countries. What are your thoughts on perhaps strengthening the groups that have been working between Israelis and Palestinians for some kind of peace and resolution? We don't hear much, but there have been books written on this possibility, and I would like to hear your thoughts on that possibility. Here.
One thing I would recommend, if you would see the documentary film Coexistence My Ass by an Israeli comedian who is really, really excellent, but it's not just a joke about coexistence my ass. It's talking about from the perspective of we are all who we are together, right? And so she makes fun of that whole dialogue about coexistence when she's actually living it. It's very interesting. Please.
Sorry. So just quickly, since most of the Gazans are not originally indigenous Gazans and were displaced there from the rest of the West Bank, let's move them back to the West Bank and let them do what they want with Gaza.
Duh.
So, but nobody's talking about that one. So, let's send them back to where they came from. Yes, but it's the West Bank. It's still Palestine.
I think it was a slip of the tongue. It wasn't.
Hi, my name is Jeannie. I'm from Watertown, Mass, and my family has a house in Wells, Maine. I just want to say I haven't heard much about the BDS movement or about voting with your dollars. And I just want to say if we make this whole genocide and occupation unprofitable for corporations, for banks, then we know that they're what's running the government. Wall Street is what's running our government. I think that could have a huge effect. Somebody brought up not buying from Amazon. That's a great idea. If you have a Capital One card, cancel it. Look at your investments for retirement. If you give money to your university, make sure they don't have any investments with Israel, et cetera, et cetera. Download the No Thanks app or the Boycat app, and that'll let you scan barcodes to see if they have ties to Israel. Money talks. We were mentioning capitalism, so money talks. Let's make it unprofitable to support Israel.
Thank you. Let's have the last two, and then we'll try to wind it up with the last round of comments. Go ahead, Dimitri.
Thank you all so much for the excellent conference today. I just had a quick announcement. Speaking of BDS, a major campaign right now is to divest from Teva, which is a major pharmaceutical company based in Israel. Please check and make sure your prescriptions are not the Teva brand, and if they are, call your pharmacy and ask them to change it to a different brand if possible. There's a bunch of flyers about this in the flyering room, and then for those of you who live in the Mid-Coast region, there's a screening of The Voice of Hen Rajab on March 14th at the Patent Free Library at 2 p.m. Thank you.
Great.
Hello again. Just more on Graham Plattner, less of a question, more of an announcement. There will be a March 23rd town hall. It's virtual, it's for students, so if there are any USM students or just anybody who wants to attend, I have answers if you have questions.
Great. Thank you, Sammy. So let's, with everything that we've heard, and essentially clearly what people's concerns and what they're actually are aiming to do more with, please just start. Go ahead, Nadia.
Okay. Wow, there's between the speakers, all your wonderful comments today, and then just everything that we've heard from everyone, so much to think with, and I don't know if others feel this. I mean, you all came from, initially I was thinking about where our speakers had come from, but you've all come from so many different places as well to be here and to be together. And I think that's really, really powerful. And hearing all the different announcements and things that people have shared, which is to say that we are already doing this work, and some of you for decades, and it's really incredible. And so I think there are ways that movement that we're seeing, whether it's the polling that a number of our speakers have talked about, these victories, the divestment victories, all the different changes that we've seen are happening, right? And I think that question that we've asked, that one of the questioners asked about, how do we move on from preaching to the choir, specifically when we're speaking, how do we broaden out? That work is already happening, and just as you were saying about the legal victories, right? You never know which little legal victory is going to be the one that takes pushes it forward, right? And ends up being really big. I think also about sort of, Phyllis, when you were narrating your sort of personal experience of how you came to where you are today, right? And those, how you went from reading Exodus on the beach to, who you are now, right? Right. As a kid, of course. But just thinking about in those conversations that we have with other people, those relations we have, the actions that we take around, like not knowing which of the little actions we make and relationships we make is going to push someone, and change how someone thinks and how someone acts in the world, right? We all had that moment. So that's really powerful for me. I want to really uplift the comment. I mean, there's so many incredible things people shared, but just from this last round, maybe I'll just focus on the one about the health of the land. I thank you for bringing that. That was so important. And I might connect it to your comment about this feeling of, or not feeling, this reality, right, of living on stolen land and what that means, and what that means our obligations are in our own context. And I think, Lindsay, you so powerfully showed us how this context here is materially connected to what happens in Palestine and what happens in so many places around the world. So it's not insular to also think about what does it mean to reckon with the fact that we are in a context of ongoing colonization right here where we are, and to fight against that, and to recognize that complicity, but then to think about what can we do where do we move from that, right? What is the next stage? What is the next step we can take from there? And I think the other thing I would say that I've had sort of on my mind that a number of you have drawn our attention to are these connections, right? Again, you showed us, Lindsay, the material ones. I've been thinking a lot as we've, this ICE surge that has happened in Portland, and that, is it over? I mean, certainly ISIS presence isn't over, right? And the ways that we see the infrastructure of the war on terror, right, that we know comes out of anti-Palestinian racism, comes out of Zionism in a lot of ways, and those very infrastructures and the languages, right, the way that people are being called domestic terrorists, right, and how that language is being weaponized now, which for me says that the urgency is not just around, coming back to what you were saying, Phyllis, about our urgency to act. It's definitely around genocide in Palestine, right? And here I mean not just in Gaza, but more broadly. And it's also very much about sort of our own lives, our own survival, our own freedom, which is completely bound up, right? And so, I think that's just what I've been thinking about, and very inspired from this conversation in terms of how we can continue to do this work together and expand it.
That's beautiful, and I couldn't agree more that the work is already happening. And I think people talked about BDS, and this is I've been telling Phyllis since before October of 2023 that BDS was really getting somewhere, and I think what has happened in the last 2+ years in terms of the acceleration of the polling and all of the things that we heard about already today. So much of that was possible because of the groundwork and the work that was done by BDS in the years prior to that. So it is cumulative, and sometimes it feels like you're not getting anywhere and you can't see where it's going, but it has added up to something, and will continue to as long as everyone keeps doing the work on it. So I wanted to answer the question or speak to the question about the memorandum of understanding and Israel saying they want no U.S. aid in the future. So a few things about that. One is whatever this memorandum ends up saying and however long the term ends up being, I'm highly skeptical that at the end of 10 or 20 years, if U.S. aid continues to be available, that Israel would not want it and take it. So first of all, let's take that with a big grain of salt, that they don't actually want that. That said, I'm sure that they want to build up their own military industry and their own military technical industries. They are already doing it. They will continue to do it. They want to continue to increase its contribution to their economy. They want to continue to make other countries reliant on them, including the United States, for a lot of this technology. And that has been increasingly true over recent years. And there's no doubt that they want to continue to move further in that direction. So that's not quite the same as not wanting U.S. aid, but they definitely want to build up their own industries and their own power in this respect. How to change that? It goes back to someone else also asked about sort of how do we deal with the demand and how do I divest when it's nation states that are demanding this and seem very receptive to what Israel has to offer, and it is largely a lot of Israeli contribution on the military tech front. So this is a real problem. A few parts of that. One is the U.S. is one of their major targets for sales for these products, right? So again, it comes back to what is the role of this country, what is the role of this country's government, and what is our role in stopping our government from enabling that and empowering it and being a consumer for it and all of that. So much comes back to the United States because we are and will continue to be a major consumer for them. And if the United States isn't buying or is buying less, that will have a real impact on what they're trying to do. So that's another job for us, is to push back on that. And there are all kinds of interesting things happening that are sort of related on that front. I think there's a lot of real energy now against pushing back on data centers locally, which is which is about, the consumption of water and the consumption of electricity and all of the kind of local issues. Again, it comes back home. But the more we slow that down, the more we slow down the progress of the tech industry overall and their ability to do all of this. So it is all connected. And then also, we should push back on being surveilled, right? That's been a fight ongoing that we haven't exactly been winning for 20 some years, but it is I think it is threatening to pick up steam again as we see a lot of new technologies come online and continue to come online with AI, and people are becoming more aware of it again. So I think it's kind of coming back around again where we have an opportunity to push back on that. So those are some of the things that we can do here in the United States to stop that. Other countries and folks, those of us who work with people in other countries can also work on similar strategies coming from everywhere else in terms of saying no to surveillance, saying no to the demand for these military tech tools. I have a question maybe for some of my fellow panelists a little bit, but there is a giant gaping hole where international law should be around some of this military tech stuff, and that's something that needs to be addressed. There's also a giant gaping hole around diplomacy for this, right? I mean, we've seen diplomacy fall down on so many fronts, and including the fact that we have no major nuclear treaties left. But we also have no treaties of any kind and never have on the military and tech stuff, and we're going to need that. So we need to kind of push that we need diplomacy and we need international law and we need all of these other things to come online and help us with this, because it is a huge problem. And then lastly, on the MOU problem, I'll just say it's not just Israel, right? I talked earlier about increasing military spending in so many places, and Canada wants to increase their spending, and they're now buying upwards of 70% of their weapons from the US, but they want to stop, they want to cut back. And so part of it is I don't want the US to be at the center of the world weapons trade the way that we have been, but that doesn't mean that I want everyone else producing a lot more weapons either. And so we have a real problem on our hands about sort of the proliferation of weapons manufacturing as other countries start trying to pull back on their reliance on the US. And that goes back to kind of the idea of, would Israel stop taking US aid, but only to produce more on their own? So again, we need some international law. We need some diplomacy. We need some real ways to address these things on a bigger basis. But we also can bring it home and push back on the data centers and push back on the surveillance and all of those things. And then another, on how to reach the middle and how to reach liberals, I think it's true. We've been doing it. We'll keep doing it. But there is lots of evidence that says that the most persuasive thing to people is someone they know. So I know it feels like banging your head against a wall to talk to your uncle or your cousin or your childhood friend or whoever may it be, but if you can stand it, keep doing it because that is the most effective thing. And then last, just really quickly on Democrats not being with us, absolutely no, they're not, and they never have been. But we need to kind of stop being so hung up on that. No, they're not with us, but it is our job, especially those of them that are our elected representatives, to push them to do what they want regardless of where they are. That is our job. And if they do it for the wrong reasons, it'd be nice if they do it for the right reasons, but I'll take the wrong reasons.
Wow. Okay, three final things, all in the context of intersectionality. That's a word we hear lots these days in the context of our broad movements, but I think it also goes directly to the question of Palestine. It goes to it in the context of speaking to the choir. For one thing, the choir needs to learn the words. We can't just take for granted that because somebody is on our side, they actually know how to talk about the issue or convince other people or understand why they're doing it. It's wonderful when people react as human beings to what they're seeing in front of them. This is not okay, right? When you see a teenager being burned to death in a tent, that's the right thing to respond to that. This is not okay. They're part of a choir. But that doesn't mean they understand why does it have anything to do with U.S. funding and the U.S. budget and $31 billion. So that's the first point about talking to the choir. We have to continue doing that. Similarly, on the question of the possibilities for actually changing how the issues around the budget are going to happen. You know, we hear a lot about, now we're hearing about the Israelis don't want any more military aid. Well, about, 15 years ago, I guess it was, they said they didn't want any more they didn't want any more economic aid. They wanted all their aid to be military. They didn't want less money. They just wanted it to go to the military side because, one, they could then say, you know, we're a big, strong economic power in our own right. We don't need your charity, which, yeah, you think. But they continued to get even more military aid, which they clearly did want. So it's a way of moving that militarization process further. And in a sense, I think what they're asking for now, first of all, they're not even hinting that they want it cut off right away. That over time, they want to cut back on military aid. But what they call partnerships is military aid. It means we would be investing in the IDF's own production of weapons, of tanks, of planes, of bombs, of all that stuff, making the US government even more directly complicit than it is now. It wouldn't be complicity, it would be direct participation. So that's what they're looking for here. This is not like, we don't need your help anymore. We need your help in a whole different way. Then the question of, well, can we change that? And I just want to point to one example where it did happen. I guess 2-3 years ago, somebody else will remember better than my addled brain, I think. The NSO company that was producing the Pegasus tech stuff that was being used for mass surveillance of this country, the White House got so embarrassed, this was under Biden, but nonetheless, there's not that much difference between them on this issue, as we know. They got so agitated at the pressures coming from both Congress and the public and the press about this question of mass surveillance that they put a company on the blacklist. NSO was put on the blacklist, meaning it could not be purchased by any US government-related entity, which was huge. That was huge. It was like a huge BDS victory. It wasn't even BDS that was calling for it particularly, but that was an amazing moment. So that can really happen. And then finally, on this question of the link between the rights of indigenous Palestinians and how we fight for those rights and how we do and don't sufficiently fight for the rights of Native people in this country, I think we need to look at some of the organizations in the Native community. A friend of mine who happens to be the ED of the Native Organizers Alliance, for instance, their work is primarily about voting rights, the rights of Native folks to both be members of their tribal nation and have that nationality and the right to vote in the United States elections because this is where they live. It's a hugely complicated thing, and they consistently come out in favor of Palestinian rights in an explicit component of their work. And I think we're seeing that a whole lot. So I think it's wonderful when it gets brought back to our discussions here and then looking at what they are doing to make those links real. So I think just overall, this speaks to the movement for Palestinian rights is not separate from the movement for the rights of BIPOC people in this country, Black and Indigenous and people of color in this country, for LGBTQ rights, for women's rights, for all of the kinds of rights that we fight for the rights of Mother Earth. These are all issues that are bound up, and Palestine is at the fulcrum of so much of this. And we are not just people in the US with an obligation to our own government, we are also citizens of the world. So we have a lot of work to do.
Just 3 comments. Somebody asked about Hamas, or something Hamas or whatever. I just finished a book on Hamas, and I've known Hamas people, Hezbollah people ever since those organizations came into being as a journalist. And my suggestion has always been, if somebody is legitimate in the eyes of their own people, they need to be legitimate in your eyes as a potential negotiating partner. They may be your foe, your enemy for some reason. You may be fighting them, and they fight you. But if you look back on the Viet Cong, if you look back on the Taliban in Afghanistan, in both cases, the U.S. tried to bomb the hell out of them and ended up negotiating with them and leaving the country, and they took over. So Hamas, I think, is in a similar situation. Whether you like them or not, or the point is they are legitimate, and they're legitimate because they are the last standing movement that does resistance and accurately represents the pretty much well-known national consensus of most of the Palestinian people, the majority of Palestinians, which used to be represented by the PLO, but the PLO doesn't exist and Fatah doesn't exist. And so Hamas is the group that has kind of taken over. And I think it's critically important for people to engage with them and learn more from what they want. And by engaging them, you're likely to find the middle ground. So that's one quick point. The second point, which is kind of related to that, is about, I use the term resistance. There's two words that really people need to know for any kind of political action, diplomatic action in the Middle East. One is humiliation, and the other is resistance. When you go in and you humiliate somebody like the US and the British did in '53 in Iran, you're going to get resistance, and that resistance can come 50, 70 years later. In Palestine, the same thing. When the Zionist movement and the British and then the Americans humiliated the Palestinians and took their land and treated them like dirt, they faced resistance non-stop. And the resistance, if it's legitimate, whether it's political, economic, military, social, educational, cultural, whatever kind of resistance people do, if it's legitimate, it'll ultimately prevail. And it's no accident that the United States and Israel, or the British and the Zionist movement before Israel created, but these two groups, the biggest Western imperial power of the day and the Zionist Israeli government group, they're the two people who for the last about 75 years have denied the Iranians and the Palestinians the right to practice self-determination, to define how they want to be governed, what are their values, what are their policies. It's no accident that it's Iran and Palestine that are the last standing resistance, not totally the last. Ansarullah in Yemen and others are doing some resistance, but they're the two most dynamic resisting groups, and there's a reason for that. And you can find out about it in two ways: either talk to them or buy the book that we published. But that's it. But you can get the book is called Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. The third point is, in terms of what this conference is trying to achieve, which I totally support, and that's why I'm here. I still didn't get my lobster roll from Fatah, but I'll take an IOU on that. I'll come back and pay it. But the point of what do we do next is a huge, I think I mentioned it in my remarks, it's really the most pressing point, I think, right now for activists, for civil society people, for NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and whatever field you are. How do you influence policy? In the end, we want to influence the policies of states, governments, and also we want to influence business, we want to influence other people, but educators, media, but we ultimately want to influence state policy. And when I look back on the years that I followed, the 60 years of starting with the Vietnam protests, what used to be called the women's lib movement or gender equality movement, the environmental movement, all these activist movements all wanted in the end to change the policy of the American government or state or local governments. So I think one of the things that would be very helpful for the coalition here and other groups and smaller groups, and maybe at a level of New England or even just Maine, but I think at the level of New England would probably be practical to set up meetings with other groups like you who are doing things aiming for change, focusing on Palestine, but also maybe looking at other issues as well. And the central question you want to raise, and the central reason to do this, is to learn from the past experiences. What did bring about change? We heard about South Africa several times today, and I think it's a critically important topic to learn from, how that change happened. And by the way, it gives us huge insights into the question which befuddles us all, which is, well, wait a minute, one state, two states, confederation, something, joint sovereignty. What do we want to recommend? It's not for us to recommend, it's for the Israelis and the Palestinians, the people there, to recommend to work it out. But I think South Africa is a fascinating example, because the South African state is still there. Blacks are still there, whites are still there, some left, some didn't, but things changed a little bit, not everything changed, but still, that's an example. So what did we learn from past experiences for activists who want to change state policy? I think that would be a really productive exercise, and you'd have small groups of people meeting for a day or 2 days at a time, whatever, and you could, I think, also enlist the work of scholars, university. A lot of us are linked to universities, professors, graduate students. If we worked out a plan to in the next year to have studies done by students in all these different topics, how change happens, that would be useful. Thank you very much for doing this, and it's been an honor for me to be with you.
So I want to address some of the points and questions that haven't been covered so far. First of all, on the U.S. Constitution and the Biden and Blinken case, yes, we have Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, which says that treaties are the law of the land in the same way as any U.S. statute. However, the courts have come up with some what we call jurisprudential doctrines, which allow the courts to defer to other branches of government in situations of, for example, the biggest one in the cases that we have brought against Israeli perpetrators, political question. The political question doctrine is the one that basically defeated the Biden and Blinken case and has defeated many cases that we have brought in the past. Some of which I've been involved in, including the Corey versus Caterpillar case. And what happens is that the courts or the judges will defer to a letter from what's called a letter of interest that the State Department almost inevitably submits in these cases, saying this is outside the jurisdiction of the court because it's a political question exclusively in the purview of the administration. Now, having said that, the Biden and Blinken case was remarkable. And the reason it was remarkable is that it got to the merits stage, which we have never been able to get to in any other case against Israeli defendants. By that I mean it got past the jurisdiction stage where usually the cases are dismissed, and the judge heard days of testimony from Palestinian witnesses, including a dear friend of mine who has lost 100 members of his family in Gaza. And the judge said, in his decision, there is no doubt in my mind that this is genocide. I never thought in my lifetime I would hear a U.S. District Court judge say something like that, let alone hear days of testimony from witnesses on Palestinian genocide. Again, State Department stepped in, the case was taken away from the court. So we have a problem with Article 6. That's not to say that we, as the legal community and as the civil society, shouldn't be pressuring our legislators to strengthen international law in our domestic decisions. I want to point out a wonderful organization called A New Policy that has been founded by Josh Paul, who resigned very publicly from the State Department. It's just launched, and he is working on legislation they are working on legislation at a lot of different levels to try to change the way the law is working and to put international law front and center in U.S. policy. So I recommend going to their website. They're doing a lot of events. I joined an event in Boston not too long ago with Josh, and we're trying to really educate people about using international law in a lot of different fora and having that knowledge, that base knowledge that you can then use in your dialogues with congresspeople, in the letters that you write, in the lobbying that you do, in the advocacy that you do. So this is also something quite new. And then on the question of the tribunal, we have held the Gaza Tribunal in 3 countries. Over the last couple of years, over 100 people helped to organize the Gaza Tribunal, although it involved many, many hundreds more. There's a website. You can see all of the testimonies, days of testimonies, both live witnesses. We had witnesses directly coming in from Gaza as the bombs were dropping. They were testifying. Doctors who had served in Gaza, you can find all of the expert papers from the chamber that I was involved in, the International Law Chamber, analyzing basically every aspect of what has been happening with Israel-Palestine. And among the really interesting and important affidavits and testimony was from the Arab Group for the Protection of Nature, APN. And they have submitted so much evidence about the destruction of the environment. And I really recommend going to the Gaza Tribunal website. And I mean, you can listen to hours and hours of testimony, but you can also look for the papers. There are some excellent papers there. We thought about having the last session of the Gaza Tribunal in New York, and we decided against it. Partly because most of our international witnesses would not be able to come. We were sure that they would be denied visas. But also we were not confident that we would have a venue that was willing to host us. So the idea to have a Gaza Tribunal here in Maine is fantastic. Do it. And you can find so many of these witnesses. The doctors will blow your mind because of what they have witnessed and are willing to talk about it. 44 doctors have come together and put together a document about the children who were shot in the head that they saw, including infants. Now, how do you justify any of that? So Gaza Tribunal, please put it on your radar. The last thing I wanted to talk about was a comment that I think didn't get really addressed, a question that didn't really get addressed about sort of denying the right of Israel to be a state. And I'm always surprised how many people say that the UN authorized a Jewish state. Neither the Balfour Declaration nor the Resolution 181 authorized a Jewish state. The Balfour Declaration talks about a home for Jews in Palestine, not a homeland. And that word was debated. And the Balfour Declaration was not passed by the British Parliament. And yet it was included in the mandate. So that tells you something about imperialism, I suppose, and legality. Resolution 181 also nowhere talks about a Jewish state. The preconditions to the recognition of states in Palestine in the resolution was a year of supervision by the United Nations. During that year, there were to be 2 constitutions drafted. And in those constitutions had to be embedded the equal rights of all of the people in both territories. The Resolution 181 does not talk about the Jewish people as an entity entitled to territorial connection. It talks about the two peoples of Palestine, and does not recognize the right of Jews extraterritorially to claim nationality in Palestine. It is consistent with international law, and I have to beg to differ a little bit with Fateh. It's consistent with international law somewhat broadly by recognizing that people who were residing in Palestine at the time had the right to citizenship and nationality in the new states. That's consistent with international law. But it never recognized the extraterritorial claim of Jews from anywhere in the world or a recognition of a Jewish state. So I recommend reading 181. It's useful. And, there is a very strong argument to be made that Israel, even aside from the conditions that were debated when Israel was up for membership at the UN, aside from those conditions, that Israel never met the conditions of 181 itself.
Just 1 minute to thank Susan and to add to that last point about 181. There's a book that I'm going to plug another book, not mine. It's coming out in a month or so by Omer Bartov. Omer Bartov is an Israeli-American scholar. He's at Brown University, tenured professor. He's one of the world's leading scholars on genocide, atrocities, and the Holocaust. He's just a brilliant, wonderful man, Jewish American, Israeli American, served in the Israeli army. He's written many books. That he wrote a book that's coming out in a month or so, and it's called Israel: What Went Wrong? And what went wrong is not a question mark. It's not like people in the West who write about the Arabs or Islam and say, what went wrong, question mark. It's an affirmative statement. Israel, what went wrong? Why did Israel, that started out with this promise of wonderful things for people, end up being a genocidal, militant, ethno-nationalist, racist state? He uses those words. And it has incredible analysis. One of them is about 181. And he has a whole chapter on why Israel never wrote a constitution, because it didn't want to, talk about the rights of other people who are not Jewish. It talks about anti-Semitism, talks about the Holocaust. It's an absolutely brilliant analysis by somebody who knows all this stuff inside out and is incredibly honest. So I recommend it. Omer Bartov, Israel, What Went Wrong. My review will come out in a few days, so again, you can see it on my Substack, but I urge you to get it and get your local library to get it.
Right. Thank you, everyone. I just want to summarize very quickly, and it looks like we're going to be able to finish in time for as many of you as can get to Monument Square by 6 o'clock for a Monument Square in Portland for a demonstration to demanding a stop to the war on Iran. So that's something you might think of doing if you're not anxious to get home and go to sleep. I have just a few takeaways from everything that you said and all of the comments of our friends here. And I will just bullet point them a little bit without a lot of discussion, just as food for thought for all of us to leave here with. And one thought I had is we are outraged. I know for myself, for the last 2.5 years, certainly, it's oscillating between rage and tears. And for most Palestinians, most of our lives, we've been in that kind of state, as we heard Samar earlier speak. And my takeaway from that, also from today, is that for sure, it's not enough to be outraged. We need to find manners and ways in which we have to channel our outrage into action, into resistance, if you will. So, we hold on to our outrage, hold on to our anger, hold on to our tears, and try and find ways that we can get through that by some kind of action, some kind of way to move forward. And we've heard a lot of possibilities of action. We talked about legal strategies. We talked about boycotts and using economic power. We talked about, the Gaza Tribunal as a public forum for airing out all of these things that should outrage every human being. The strategies are many. The approaches are many. And I think each of us has propensities towards a certain kind of approach. Writing a letter to one representative is an act of resistance. Some people do that a lot better and more than others do. That's fine. Going out on the street with a sign is an act of resistance. Some people do that, others don't feel comfortable doing that very much. That's fine too. Some people write articles and op-eds, others don't write very well. It doesn't really matter. Anything that any of us does in the direction of resisting this outrage, of challenging our outrage into action, can work. Now, certainly, the more we can do it together, possibly the more effective we can be. So if we find like-minded people, like the Coalition of Palestine, everybody's welcome to join, by the way, if you haven't yet, then, that will just amplify the resistance in one way or another. And you can do that in many different directions, whether you adopt legal strategies or public information strategy or whatever. The other takeaway I had from the information, certainly from what Lindsay was offering us and from what Phyllis was telling us about and the histories and the legal strategies that Susan was talking about, is the importance of being informed, of knowing what the information is. It's not enough to speak in general ideological terms. This is so awful, this is terrible. Yes, of course it's awful and terrible, but why is it so awful and terrible? Well, it's not fair. Okay, it's not fair. Why is it not fair? Get the data in, get the information in, learn about the numbers, learn about how much money, how many billions of dollars, learn how much that affects what our lives are. So in other words, invest some time and energy. If you're not that clear about a certain part of history, look it up, find it, learn it, and make that part of your arsenal. It just seems to me, crucial that we can be so much more effective the more informed we are. The last thing that I would say is we can be very creative in our strategies. And the more creative we are, the more interesting resistance becomes. Resistance doesn't have to be this dark, I'm angry, I'm going to go and I'm going to, no matter how well informed I am. The more creative we are, the more interesting I think our resistance can be. The more interesting not only to me, but to those who are listening to me or participating in my strategy. And there have been a number of I'll give one example that we did in the Coalition for Palestine. When the flotilla thing was happening, we did our own kayak flotilla in Portland. Remember that? Yeah. And it was lovely, and it brought people together, right? When we had a hunger strike, we had a hunger strikers caravan move from up north in Maine down the coast all the way through, and some even went as far as New York and joined the Veterans for Peace hunger strikers? That's a very creative strategy, and that brought us together nicely. It felt good to be part of that effort, right? I do a lot of cultural resistance. We have music, bringing people together, singing and dancing and reaffirming identity and, all of that. So all of these is what I'm trying to say are possible. We have a tendency sometimes to think, oh, no, well, that doesn't work, this works better. Or no, this is not. And what we're really saying is that I prefer doing that rather than this. It doesn't necessarily mean that this strategy is better than the other one. My view is that all strategies are good, as long as it's a strategy, as long as it involves some kind of action. And I think we leave each other with that thought in mind, right? Thank you so very much for coming, for hanging in there with us. Thank you once again to Reverend Christine, our tech guru, as well as our host and friend. Thank you.